Hello, this is Marshall Heilman from Anton and Anton Chuvakin from Google Cloud. Today, the topic is how to prepare for threat detection and incident response in the cloud. For many organizations, public cloud computing brings up challenges that they don't really know how to solve in terms of preparing for incidents, in terms of even understanding what an incident means. So I want to highlight some of the differences and similarities between cloud incident response and on-premise incident response. So before we go there, we want to understand the motivation, the why. Of course, we all know public cloud computing is a big deal, but the thing is, it's getting bigger. More companies are transforming, more organizations are building capabilities in this area, and that means more attackers are interested. Marshall?
Yeah, thanks, Anton. And from Mannion's perspective, we are absolutely seeing attackers follow this trend. As more organizations are moving their critical assets into the cloud, as more users are interacting with cloud-based services like the G Suite, right, or like M365, we are seeing attackers target those services and target those assets because that is where users and data are migrating to. As a matter of fact, this problem is becoming so pervasive, not just in the cloud, that insurance companies have raised insurance premiums 79% in 2021. And that was after doubling their rates in 2020. So this is obviously a huge problem, and attackers are understanding how to go and get data in the cloud. Now, if you want to read a little bit more on the subject, the Google GCAT team issues an annual report called Threat Horizons, and Mandiant issues an annual report called M-Trends.
Perfect. But before we go further, we want to understand a little bit what it means to have a cloud security incident. So to me, the critical dimensions are it's a security incident that touches cloud assets or happens inside the public cloud environment. Data theft from cloud storage, theft of cloud compute resources, using cloud infrastructure for malicious purposes. These are all clear and obvious examples of cloud security incidents. And of course, you see a lot of these headlines in the news, both on the data theft side and as well as on the theft of computing resources. Now, before we go further, I want to understand what challenges organizations face with dealing with such incidents. Marshall?
Yeah, thanks, Anton. So the first challenge from a very high level is simply skills. Understanding how to investigate systems that are on-premise or in a data center is not exactly the same as understanding how to investigate cloud-based assets where assets are a bit more ephemeral than they were. You have organizations that have multiple cloud environments running their systems and the data passing back and forth between them. There's also the joint nature of performing incident response in the cloud. As you can see from the graphic on the left, you can see the shared responsibility model between Google Cloud and their customers. So as an investigator, you're not necessarily going to have access to all assets and data from the victim organization. You're going to have to go to the CSP to get access to those assets and those data. That is a change. And finally, there's the data itself. In many cases, for a cloud-based compromise, the amount of data that you have access to is simply overwhelming. There's just so much log-based data generated from cloud assets. Additionally, the type of telemetry that you see is going to be very different in the cloud than it's going to be in an on-premise environment. And we're going to dive into some of these details in the next couple of slides.
Perfect. And before we go there, we kind of understand that some of the same challenges affect us at the stage before IR, when we are actually detecting threats. To me, while a lot of people obsess about the volumes of telemetry, it's the alien context behind detections. The IP address is not just an IP address. It's not a server. It's maybe an indicator of some ephemeral asset, or it may be an endpoint, or it may be an API endpoint. To me, it's the difference in context, lack of skills at some SOCs, and just lack of understanding how cloud functions. That's what makes detection and response challenging in the cloud. However, basic machinery to some extent is the same. So let's talk similarities first. Marshall?
Sure, Anton. So when performing an investigation, there are definitely some similarities between an on-prem or data center environment and the cloud. First is data preservation requirements. The way that you preserve data may be different, but the fact that you have to preserve data, so whether it's a container or an image or log data, there are regulatory and legal requirements that organizations have to follow and investigators have to follow to prove the accuracy of what they found at a later point in time. That doesn't change whether you're in an on-prem environment or a cloud environment. The second thing that stays the same is you have to have an understanding of the environment to know what you're investigating. It's very hard to investigate what you don't understand. And so whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, understanding how technology works, understanding how systems communicate with one another, understanding where critical data is. All of these types of understanding are critical regardless of the environment that you are investigating. The third one is that standard investigative techniques have not changed. You start with a fact. You start with something, whether it's a detection or a piece of information that someone gave you, you know that something is wrong. You start with that particular fact or that piece of data, and you spiral the investigation out from there. You don't go and create a couple hypotheses on what could have happened and go investigate all these different hypotheses. You start with a fact, that one piece of data, and you figure out everything that happened around the fact, and you keep spiraling and spiraling until you understand the totality of the incident in that particular environment. Fourth, log data. Regardless of the environment you're in, it needs to be retained. As I said, from preservation requirements, it needs to be normalized. It needs to be correlated. It needs to be analyzed. You have to deal with a huge amount of data regardless of the environment you're operating in. I used to say when I was an investigator that time is the bane of any investigator's existence, and it is still true today. You have to deal with time zone issues. You need to make certain that you are paying attention to the time zone that the log data entries are in, so that you're not off by a couple of hours. You need to make certain that you pay attention to time skew, which is where different assets may have the time set incorrectly. So maybe you're off by a couple seconds or a couple minutes, or in one case, you're off by a couple months. And can you imagine the havoc on an investigation if it looks like the attacker was doing certain things months apart when really it was done seconds apart? You just didn't properly count for time skew. So time continues to be an issue in any investigation, regardless of environment. And then finally, each incident is different. It doesn't matter if it's the exact same attack group before going after the same type of data in two different companies. The reality is the investigation is going to be different because the environment is different. And even if the environment is the exact same, the company or the business realities, the operational realities for that particular company, they're going to be different. And so how you handle, how you react to that particular incident will be unique for every single one, regardless of whether you're on-prem or in the cloud.
To me, the most fascinating part is exactly the last point, is that the similarities between on-premise IR and cloud IR is that every incident is different. But guess what? If your incident involves multiple clouds and on-premise environment, you can thank these challenges for dealing with more time skews, more types of log data. But relying on similar investigative techniques is critical, because that's what gives you an island of sanity in all this multiple types of data, multiple types of operational environments, multiple companies in case of a CSP. So to me, this is an interesting bundle of things if we apply it to multi-cloud and mix of multi-cloud and on-premise environments. But here, these can be used as kind of 5 pillars to understand that IR is ultimately the same. But wait a second. Aren't there also big differences? Here, we want to highlight the fact that while understanding the realm is important, the realm itself is quite different. And it's different not just because we use containers versus servers or VMs are hosted somewhere else. It's really the tech, but also the operational realities of the cloud. Its ephemeral nature, its auto-scaling, its APIs. All this means that the realm itself, where we are investigating, where the attackers act, where we are detecting threats, where we trace or backtrace the steps of the attacker, it is different, it's built differently. And sometimes I always want to say that it's built on different principles, that assumptions that were true in a data center just flat out aren't true anymore. Even if you are of the lift and shift variety, where you copied your virtual machines to the cloud, still, a lot of things have changed significantly. And again, the shared nature of it is there. Now, the second point sounds kind of obvious. Of course, you need deep technical expertise. But to me, the critical bit is not just understanding how containers differ from VMs or what storage as a service really means. It's kind of knowledge of technology, but also knowledge of the different practices, different operational realities. Sure, you may know how containers work, but do you know how DevOps works? Do you know what's an SRE, how they do things, how they run things, how modern IT, for the lack of a better term, does things differently in cloud environments? Why do some enterprises release software every year and some cloud companies release software every day? That changes things on a deeper level, and us as investigators would have to deal with that. Now, different baselines and norms is an expanded version of this question about item about similarities and differences. The baselines, the learning the environment, sure, they're all useful items as we highlighted, but the machinery and the methods and the technology for this is just different. So when we say understand the environment, it may not mean which server is located on what floor, like you'd have in a data center. It may mean understanding how code is pushed, understanding where data flows, understanding where what is encrypted with what key. All this matters, and a lot of this is different, even if you more or less copied your environment to the cloud as a first step. Now, we highlighted log retention as item number 4, and there's a similar item on our what's the same list. But guess what? As I highlighted on the detection slide, the context for a lot of this is different. You would not have user such and such connected from IP address such and such to server such and such. That's out of the window. You would have logs and activities coming from deep inside the applications. You'd have things mentioning services, microservices, connections, data flows. And a lot of this would be referring to objects that just flat out don't exist. And what's in your logs? Sure, you have logs, you have a volume of logs, but what it means, you'd have to learn. So it kind of connects your items 1, 2, and 3 together, because otherwise, unless you hit understand 1, 2, and 3, your 4 wouldn't produce useful evidence for investigation. Now, we do talk quite a bit about being reliant on CSP, cloud service provider. You're not reliant for cloud service provider on all the tasks. You can collect the logs, you can pull things over APIs, you can pull logs of instances. Now, cloud in 2022 isn't what it was in 2012. There is a lot more ways to collect useful telemetry. There are many more methods, cloud native and more traditional, to get data. But there will be things where you are reliant on a cloud provider for some access. Marshall, you had a fun view on the different norms in the cloud. Care to share your perspective here?
Yeah, Anton, absolutely. We've definitely had a couple of situations where when we were performing an investigation, all the data that we needed to really piece together what happened between the different assets in the cloud wasn't available to us. And we've seen this happen a couple of times where that data is actually contained in service logs that the CSP has access to because they're providing that service, whether it's infrastructure or platform or software as a service. And so we had to go to the CSP to actually get access to that data. So this wasn't customer data. This was cloud service provider data that we needed access to be able to completely piece together the totality of what the attacker did in the environment. Not only that, when you find yourself in situations like that, obviously you need a specific skill set and a specific understanding of how those assets and how those services are operating in that particular cloud environment. And even for us, professional incident response firm, that was difficult. We had to spend some time really learning, how do these assets operate in the cloud? Why is an attacker doing a thing? And why aren't we seeing access, or why aren't we seeing some of the data we would have expected to see? Well, it's because in a cloud environment, it's different. You have to go to a CSP to get access to certain types of logs, and you have to really understand how some of these different platform and infrastructure and software as a service services are working and how they interact with the customer.
Yes, and this is, to me, is a useful item that ultimately a lot of this would be a three-way dance: customer, CSP, and an IR firm, or possibly an MDR service provider. We covered some of the key differences and some of the similarities, and hopefully you have a bit of a structure in your mind about how to prepare for incident response. But we want to highlight some of the specific items you can do to prepare today. So Marshall, care to start this one?
Yep. So the first thing you can do is baseline your environment, understand your norms. And what we mean by that is during an investigation, time is critical. You want to make certain that your investigators are able to understand your environment and get answers to their questions as rapidly as possible. That is so much easier if you, as an organization, really understand how to, how do your where are your assets located? How does data flow throughout your environment and so forth? For example, if you've got a set of servers that are ephemeral in nature and maybe they get refreshed every 24 hours, you don't want an investigator running around and figuring that out a couple of days after the fact. You want the investigator to know upfront that he's simply never going to find that system. He'll never be able to perform live response or forensic analysis on that system because it no longer exists. However, because you have a well set up environment, you've captured operating system and application logs from that system. So we know as an investigator to go and look at the log data for that particular system. The second aspect here is understanding your security profile. You want to make certain that you are protecting your crown jewels. You are protecting your assets in the best possible way against attackers that are going after you. Now, I want to give a little bit of an example here, Anton. So there have been a number of times where I've worked with usually smaller companies. And when I'm talking to them about why an attacker is in their environment, I'll get answers like, well, I don't know. Or, we don't have any critical data. There's no reason for an attacker to be targeting me. And in almost every single case, when we are able to identify the data that the attacker was going after, and we show that to the customer or to the victim organization, the responses we get back are something like, oh no, that is who we are as a company, right? That is our intellectual property. I can't believe they took that. And it's like, aha, you do have some critical assets, right? You do have critical data. And understanding that helps you as an organization figure out what type of security do you need to put in place to protect those critical assets. The third here is to prepare logs and telemetry. The worst possible time to realize that you need data you didn't save is during an investigation. You want to know ahead of time that you're saving the majority of data that will be needed in an investigation just in case. Similarly, with technology and skills, you want to make certain that your team is trained properly to understand how your environment operates and to answer those technical questions that an IR team is going to have of you specific to your environment to save them that critical time. There's also conducting realistic red and blue team exercises. So one of the best things you can do as an organization is bring in an external organization and say, here are my crown jewels, or, here are my assets that I cannot have an attacker get access to. See if you can do it and try and prove it. And if someone is able to access those assets, you want to go and implement security measures that prevent them from doing whatever it was they did to gain access to those assets. Because again, the wrong time to learn that your assets are vulnerable is when an attacker has access to your environment. The right time is when you hire a reputable external firm to come in and do that work for you, and then you put appropriate security measures in place to prevent it from happening again. And finally, change your security program to match cloud needs. We oftentimes see organizations that have a security posture that work for them for their on-prem environment, but when they move their assets to the cloud, especially if they do what Anton talked about earlier, that lift and shift, they think that their security posture remains the same. But the reality is that it doesn't, because the cloud operates very differently than on-prem, as we just spent the last few minutes talking about, and we need to make certain that our security profile appropriately matches our cloud environment and those critical assets in the cloud. Anton, do you have more to add to that?
To me, yes, I think I almost want to double down on the last point is as a lot of people do show up in the cloud and they have to not just learn cloud, but they have to map their mental models to what happens in the cloud and what are the cloud realities. To me, this is probably one of the critical points from the entire show is that they kind of have to adjust. There would be adjustments in what they do, how they do it, what they learn, as well as other things. So while we are at the end, we wanted to highlight that in the near future, a lot more exciting things in this area would come from Mandiant and Google Cloud doing things together. This applies to both intelligence, transforming operations, and of course, utilizing some of the similar tooling for this. Marshall, you had a point about GRR.
Yeah, so what I want to point out is that Mandiant is standardizing on using the GR Rapid Response open source utility that Google publishes to make certain that all of the forensic capabilities that we need are going to be built into that tool going forward. And we're going to be leveraging that along many of the powerful EDR solutions that we are partnering with to make certain that there is one particular forensic tool that has access or has every single capability that we need as an investigative firm. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the great things that Google Cloud and Mandiant, now that we're part of the same organization, are going to be doing in the future. So first is we're going to be looking at really transforming how security operations and incident response is done, not just in the cloud, but also in on-premise environments by taking a lot of our technology and combining it. We are also going to be taking data from two of the most intelligent powerhouses in the world, Google Cloud and Mandiant, and combining it so that our customers get the best benefit from the best intelligence in the industry. And finally, we are going to be supporting the GR Rapid Response open source forensic utility, which applies for both on-premise systems as well as cloud-based systems, to make certain that all the capabilities that we need as an incident response firm is built into this utility so that the entire community benefits.
Perfect. And if you want to learn more about things we covered, we highlight the links to Threat Horizons reports, Google Cybersecurity Action Team, and of course, Mandiant blog and mTrends resources. Take a look. Thank you very much for your attention.